good evening, everyone. I hope everybody is having a blessed and wonderful week so far, and hopefully you've been enjoying our study through the book of 1 Thessalonians. And so this evening we are going to continue on in our fashion of digging into God's Word. And so we're going to find our place in 1 Thessalonians 5, chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And in this section, while it's kind of an offset side of what we discussed last week in terms of the coming of the Lord and the proclamation and the shout of the archangel and the trumpet sounding and premillennial dispensationalism and post-trib, mid-trib rapture, amillennialism, all these different things, it's kind of the other side of it is saying, okay, as Paul closed out chapter 4 by saying these things are going to happen, he's now kind of using chapter 5 to go back and say, okay, but before those things get here, these are the things and the ways you need to be prepared in leading up to those moments. And so Paul in this section is reminding us why it's important to be faithful and steadfast, because once you're dead, you're dead. There is no second chances. There are no more opportunities. It is done. Finite. It is the end of all things as it pertains to this life. And so death is final, and so we must remember that we have a responsibility to carry the baton and run our race and then pass it off. I mean, the goal is to finish strongly. We don't want to stand before the Lord and be, incomplete, or we don't want to be lacking in anything. And so that not Christianity will not die away, so to speak, but that future generations they're guaranteed a rich endowment of what Christianity is, the faith that we have, the trust that we hold to whenever it comes to a relationship with God and His Word. And so thinking through those things, I want us to kind of dive off into verses 1 through 3 here, okay? Because whenever it comes to chapter 5, verses 1 through 3, we're kind of looking at, a way to think about what it means to live in life, or live our lives before Christ returns and calls us home. So as we look in verse 1, it says, "But concerning the times and the seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you." So kind of like if you think about in chapter 4 verse 9, what does Paul say over there? "But concerning brotherly love, you have no need that I should write to you." So in the same fashion, this is Paul saying, okay, in terms of the time and the seasons, there again, this is kind of what exactly the world is looking like, how the world is shaping up to be. He's saying you're not oblivious. You've got your eyes open. You can see the political unrest. You can see the controversies. You can see the Roman government and kind of what it's leading towards. He's saying that you're not blind towards those things. You recognize them. You see them and may not fully understand them, but something is unsettled, so to speak, in your spirit, And so there's a lot of ways into which we think about how Paul is using this, is that he's saying that you understand those things, but it's almost a reminder of what is going on, because it's kind of that moment of, it's hard to see the forest through the trees kind of thing. I mean, sometimes it's the outlook that prevents us from seeing the outcome. And that's what we need to be thinking about here, is that, Paul is saying, you are walking in the midst of these things. You're going through there and you're, walking in this life. But, going back to chapter 4, you're not going to mourn as other people would mourn. You're not going to suffer like other people would suffer. According to what we could think over in 2 Corinthians, chapter 4, we are given this spirit to continue on. We may be crushed, but we're not destroyed. All these mentalities of, we're gonna struggle, but it's not going to be nearly like what everybody else struggles. Why? Because there's this faith that continues on through it. And it is that faith that he's talking about here that is that seat in the back of our mind that says, okay, Christ is going to return. Christ is coming back. He's not just dropped us like a hot rock and He's left us here to fend for ourselves, on our own. It doesn't work like that. We know that these things are true and they are coming. And so whenever it comes to the end times, we are called to be ready to depart this life. Okay, so thinking about in chapter 5 here, verses 1 through 3, we know that Paul is addressing and saying, okay, you know the times that you're walking in, you know the things you're struggling with, so I shouldn't and I do not need to write you, but yet he goes into it and he says, okay, for you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. So chapter 5 here, verse 2 is the first of two illustrations that he uses to compare, of course, the coming of the Lord. Okay, so the thief in the night illustration, it can happen at any time. Matthew chapter 24, it talks about how there will be one in the field, one in the boat, and all these different things, and it'll just be in a spur of the moment, twinkling of an eye, it'll just happen and be done. He's saying it's that kind of readiness that, this video may not even end and the rapture happens. The rapture happens. It's one of those things that we are to be constantly at ready or being able to say, I'm good to go. It's it's funny because I read through these things, and he follows verse 2 by saying, be ready like a thief in the night, being prepared for that it could come in at any moment. But he says, for when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them. And that's I guess what helps me to identify right now where our world is at. I mean, it's no secret. I mean, I get so frustrated watching the news just because, we've got rioting going on in our major cities and all these different things over lawlessness and, but it's the fact that there's such a delusion to it that what are the parties saying? They're saying that, we're having peaceful protest and all these different things, but yet cars are burning to the ground, buildings are being burnt to the ground, people are fighting for their lives, police officers and law enforcement across the major cities of our country, I don't see how they're not struggling, knowing that people are abusing them, but they can't do anything about it. I mean, it's all lawlessness, but yet here in verse 3, what do we say? For when they say peace and safety. It carries its own meaning right now in our culture, unfortunately. It's those that are saying, it's peaceful, it's safe, all these different things. It is a delusion, and it is anything but peace. It is anything but safe. And that's the thing. That is why, even in today, to where we look at in Paul's culture here in 1 Thessalonians, we're seeing the same mentality of the people in the first century world. They were living under a delusion saying, this isn't bad, whatever the case is, trying to pacify the moment for it inevitably to lead to a place to where it was going to go south real quick and in a hurry. And that's Paul saying, don't listen to the people that are saying it's okay, it's peace, it's safety. Don't listen to them. Now, if you want to carry that over in today, I would say it definitely applies. Do not listen to the people that are saying peace and safety whenever it is anything but peace, whenever it is anything but safe. It is a delusion, but yet we are called to be able to be prepared for that thief in the night. It reminds me of the old story of the woman who kept telling her husband, honey, I want you to go downstairs and check to make sure there's no thieves in the house. So night after night, year after year, the husband continues going downstairs, and yet night after night, year after year, there's no thief in the house, but she wants to be ready, right? And so eventually, 30 years into it, he goes down that final night, and he goes down, and sure enough, there's somebody standing in their living room. And after 30 years of checking every night, what does he do? He doesn't kick him out. He says, hey, my wife has been waiting for you. Come upstairs. You need to meet her. It's one of those things that in that very same fashion, it's not a matter of if, but when is basically what we're thinking through. We know that the coming of the Lord, it is imminent. It is going to happen. It is going to take place. And here, Paul uses this first expression of a thief in the night, but then he goes over and he's talking in verse 3, and he kind of closes it out by saying, and as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. And that's what I find so amazing about all these things is that, I've always heard it, we're living in the days of Jeremiah, and if you've never taken the time to kind of explore the book of Jeremiah, I would definitely encourage you to do so. I mean, Jeremiah is known as the weeping prophet. In terms of roughly 40 years of ministry, he only saw basically 10 people come to know Christ, or, to trust in God. And I mean, think about that. Not even once a year, so to speak, or, if you were to go through and think about the time gap, I mean, maybe 2 people a year, 3, over the course of 40 years, I don't know. It's a whirlwind, but nevertheless, it's one of those things that he begins to make it over into chapter 5 here, verse 3, about labor pains, and he's basically saying, once a woman starts into labor, there is no stopping it. Once the water breaks, it's officially go time. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how hard you try. That baby is coming one way or another. And you can either be, surprised by it and, oh, no, that doesn't mean anything. Or you can embrace for what is about to change. As a man with 4 kids, my life changed significantly every time my wife's water broke. Why? Because there was a child that came as the result of it. I mean, there was no way to go around it. Once the water breaks, there's no stopping it or reversing it. But yet, those labor pains, whenever they begin, they're only going to increase. They're only going to get worse. And so what is he talking about here? What does he say? As labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. Look into this. There again, not trying to make what is applicable and necessarily into our culture and society today, but just stop and think about the trueness of it all and how much the dots really connect. I mean, what does it say? It's only going to get worse and worse. Those labor pains are going to become more intense until the child arrives. Our world is going to grow worse and worse until the sun arrives. He steps out of the eastern sky and he comes back to gather and call his children home. We all know someone who needs God. We all know somebody who is far from God right now. And unfortunately, we can't force them to accept Him. But it doesn't mean we can just give up either. We've got to be there to continue living our lives that people will be able to see Him. And so in verses 4 and 5 on through the rest of chapter 5 here, verse 11, what we're going to find is Paul using various analogies, different ways to say, what is the hope of the believer, basically. And so here in verses 4 and 5, Christians are not living in darkness is what he makes known, but you, brethren, are not in darkness, so that this day should overtake you as a thief. You are sons of the light and sons of the day, and we are not of the night nor of the darkness. I mean, just like going back to John chapter 1, who is Christ? He is the light of the world. He is the light of our lives. He is exposing the darkness. There are a lot of people who are living in darkness, who are living in that delusion. There are a lot of people who are going to be completely surprised at the return of Christ. But what is he saying? Okay, that's the world. But Christian believers, who are you? You are people of the light. You are, as 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9 tells us, we are called out of darkness into His marvelous, glorious light. So as a result of these things, he's saying the darkness is not going to overcome us. Why? Because the darkness cannot overcome Christ, as John 1 verses 1 through 5 tell us. It is that same implication that no matter what happens and goes on for the Christians who are faithful to the end, which I would add 1 Timothy chapter 4 verse 1, it says that there's going to be Christians who fall away over the course of the period of time. Don't be that individual. Don't succumb to the things of this world, the pressures of the media and the news and all these different things, but yet be sanctified, be solidified in Christ. The joke right now is that whenever it comes down to it and we're thinking about this, is that there's people that actually believe that they're as good as gold, and that you can't do anything with. We know that the Lord's return is imminent and it is going to happen. In verse 6 he says, "Therefore let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night. Those who get drunk are drunk at night." So 2 more verses that outline kind of that darkness versus light scenario. We know in Galatians chapter 5 that light and darkness do not coexist. You cannot have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. It's a metaphor of saying that what is of God's is God's, what is of this world is the world's, and they do not mix. They're like oil and water. You cannot do it that way. And so he uses these illustrations of saying, therefore, let us not sleep as others do. So there again, kind of like we learned in chapter 4, verse 13 there, it's not necessarily as a sleep of death or an actual sleep as much as it's an ignorance. Do not let us be unaware, brethren, about what is going on around us. So he's saying, yeah, we have to sleep. That's the physical reality and nature of any human being. But he's saying even the way we sleep is going to be with an alertness to it. And so that's what he's trying to persuade us towards right here. Therefore, do not let us sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8 says, "Be sober, be diligent, for the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour." It's the principal nature of the moment that we let our guard down is the moment that the world begins to infiltrate and take over. And that's where we have to be diligent not to let that happen. And so for verse 7, he says, "For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night." Well, there again, there's all this debauchery. There's all these things that go into our culture and our world, and it is no different in their culture versus today. Daylight is, significant of positive, and nighttime is significant of evilness, of wickedness. You don't really, on occasion you'll find them, but, for the most part, people don't get drunk during the day. They get drunk at night. People don't struggle during the day. They struggle at night. There's something about the darkness that looms over us like a black cloud, so to speak, that, it messes with our mind. It messes with our intellectual insights. And as believers, this is where Paul is saying, hey, be aware of what you surrender yourself to. There again, he talks about being drunk and drinking and all these different things. Whether it's here, he says be sober. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, he says be sober. There is a very real compatibility that is found into that. And that's why even as believers, I say to anyone, it is not worth it to drink because of the fact that you do not know what will come as a result of it. You are gambling not only with your life, but with your family's lives, with other lives, about what exactly you are doing. But yet, oftentimes, this is what we find. It is associated with the things and the wickedness of this world. So in verse 8, he says, "But let us who are of the day be sober." So here, for a second time, he says, "Be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and of love, and a helmet and as a helmet of the hope of salvation." So, of course, going back over to Ephesians chapter 6 and the armor of God passage there, there's even a point of suggesting that there comes a point that it's related back to Isaiah 59, because there, Isaiah portrays God as having the armor and everything. Paul makes it known here this is for the Christian believer, while he doesn't talk about the shoes and the belt and all the other things associated with Ephesians chapter 6. Nevertheless, here, he's using it as a way of saying we've got to be armored up. So there's the idea of saying we shouldn't try to look too deeply into it and allegorize it as to making it appear to be something that it's not, as much as it is Paul just saying we need to be on the defense. We need to be ready to go at battle at any given moment. We need to be ready to defend the hope and the faith, as 1 Peter 3:15 tells us, as it relates to our lives. So gear up and be ready to take the Word of God wherever it needs to go. And he says in verse 9, "For God did not appoint us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with him. Therefore, comfort each other and edify one another, just as you also are doing." So Paul closes out, this part of the passage, to which next week's passage, there again, it's another point of just, it's Christian application, it's Christian living. But what is he doing here in verses 9 through 11? He's reminding them of the hope of the salvation that Christ has blessed them with, that Christ has freely gave over to them. I mean, it's beautiful. God did not appoint us, in verse 9, to wrath, but to obtain salvation. You know, what did Christ say in John chapter 10, verse 10? He said, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But what's the second part of that verse? But he says that Christ came to bring life and to bring it more abundantly. God does not want misery and shame and defeat and anger and all these things to be what consumes your life. Christ wants you to be free of those things. And the only way you will be free of those things is if Christ sets you free. John chapter 8, verse 36. For those who call on the name of the Lord, you shall be free indeed. And so we must remember that that is the purpose of who God is through Christ, is to die for us on a cross in verse 10, who died for us, that whether we wake or sleep, we should live together with Him. He wants communion with us. He wants fellowship and a relationship with us. He wants that closeness. And there again, I would imagine I shouldn't have to say this, but yet I'm going to. The further we are living into this world and participating in the things of this world, the further we're going to be from God. There's not going to be that closeness. Oftentimes I hear week after week, month after month, year after year, well, you know, this just ain't going right, or that ain't going right. And the more I talk to them, what do I learn? The more they're closer to the world than what they are of Christ. And so he says in verse 11, therefore, comfort each other and edify one another, just as you also are doing. And so here in verse 11, you know, let this be the reminder. Christ loves us. He died on a cross for us. But we're to stick together like glue. We're supposed to remain close until the day of the Lord, or He calls us home. I hope y'all have a blessed and wonderful day. If y'all need anything, please let me know. But I guess at this point, we'll continue on next week, and we'll go from there. Thank you, guys.